Hi, I'm Blake Gray, and I'm here with Chris Howell. He is a chief wine grower at Cain Vineyard and Winery. They're in the Napa Valley. Chris is a very interesting and thoughtful wine grower who I've had a lot of interesting conversations with over the years. We are going to talk today about the very nature of wine itself and the experience that Americans have of reaching out to wine. So, Chris says he's got a bit of a spiel he wants to start with. So let's spiel.
Thank you, Blake. There's no one else I could think of that I would like to talk to about this, and I think it could be an interesting conversation. It's one that's been troubling me for quite a long time now. I asked Blake if we could talk about the meaning of wine, and I use the expression "what is wine," and we could also say "what does wine mean?" And I invite everyone listening to just think about that for yourselves, how we think about wine. What is wine? I'm going to lead with a quote that a fellow dropped on me about 10 years ago. He said, in a moment of confidentiality, I would say, wine is magic. And he let it pause, and then he said, because nobody knows what it's worth. And I'll tell you more about that in a bit. But first, I was thinking, to talk about how I learned about wine, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, because some of this I know I haven't told you, Blake. I grew up in Seattle, and there really was very little wine there. My father worked for Boeing, and he was exported to Torino, Italy, to work in a collaboration with some Italian aeronautical engineers. And these engineers invited the outsider to family dinner on Sunday nights with grandma. And my father had that experience, that quintessential experience you can all imagine, of the family around the table with food that's been cooked for a day or two, and wonderful wine, and just simple, but a beautiful approach to life. And he came home realizing that food and wine could be of great interest. And the truth is, on the West Coast in the United States, there had been a growing interest in food and wine for decades at that point. So we're about 1971, 72, somewhere in there. And eventually, he took me to visit a winery in Seattle, of all places. And it was really the second winery that was producing grapes from vinifera, what we call wine grapes, as opposed to Concord grapes, which are also used for grape juice. And we visited this winery on a Saturday morning to pick up a case of wine that he had ordered. And you can imagine, he didn't order it over the internet. He didn't order it over the fax machine. He had to have gotten something in the mail and written them a check and mailed it in. And we went to visit this winery. And what it was, we were in a light industrial, basically parking lot with a roll-up door and a bay of rented space, exactly the way people make wine today.
Yeah, and that place in Santa Barbara County.
Exactly. So this one was in Bellevue, and it was being operated by a bunch of college professors who had just hired the first master of wine to land in North America. His name is David Lake. He's Canadian of origin, and yet he did his MW in England, because that's the only place you could do it at that time. And he came out, and he was making the wine for these college professors in this roll-up industrial space. And what kind of wine did we get? Well, we got Cabernet, we got Chardonnay, and that's as much as we really knew. The variety, the vintage, we knew it was from Washington State. The college professors knew the vineyard where they'd gotten it. The truth is, there weren't a lot of choices about where you could get grapes. They were just getting grapes, and obviously they were getting barrels, and you can imagine what kind of barrels. At that time, it wasn't easy, but I'm sure they had both American and French oak barrels. And that was our understanding of wine, really. The variety and the process. We could say, what kind of grapes were they? Chardonnay. What kind of barrel, maybe? That's it. That's the way I understood wine in 1976. So I went off to France. I got really interested in wine, so much so that I went off to France to study wine making as a budding enologist. And I was very lucky to go to a school that insisted that I study grape growing, and I knew nothing about farming. What a gift. But learning about growing the grapes was still a sort of a production mentality for me, but still I was learning the technology of the vineyard and of the winemaking. And then I had winemaking experiences in France. And you know, it still took me quite a while to get to the perspective that I have today. But first, I just want to share one moment. My first harvest in the Napa Valley was at Clos du Val. And Clos du Val was one of the really interesting original wineries of the 70s. It started at the same time as Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. And it was run by a Frenchman who had gone to the same school I did. Bernard Portet went to school in Montpellier. And at that time, with my crush internship, they had a reception celebrating the first 10 years of the existence of the winery. And I think they meet the structure, not the label. And so there was a party, and I was the kid, and there were these various people coming through who would probably be all famous to us today. And I remember them muttering. Oh, I remember when there was just, and I think the number was either 25 or 35 wineries, because in 1984, celebrating the first 10 years of Clos du Val, there were 100 wineries in the Napa Valley. And people were saying, oh, I remember when. I thought, you know, just going back so many years thinking about that and what that was. And I was going to ask you, Blake, how many wineries did you say we have in Napa today?
I believe it's over 500, which is crazy because Napa hasn't gotten any bigger.
No, it really hasn't. And how many labels are there in the Napa Valley?
Well, that's another thing, because these 500 wineries, now some of them may be virtual. They may not actually have a winery building, but a lot of wineries are responsible for more than one label. So I would guess it's got to be more than 1,000 labels. It has to be.
Yeah, I think it's in the ballpark of 1,000 labels. And you know, I can't help myself, but I've sort of mentioned this to friends, certainly back in Bordeaux, where I have friends and where I've worked, and they said, "Oh my, Chris, really 1,000 wineries? How many do you think we have in Bordeaux?" And of course, I have no idea.
I have no idea, but I know it's a lot. It may be more, and those are different because they don't have a lot of virtual wineries. Those are actually somebody with their little piece of land making their own wine.
Yep, that's true. And most of these we've never heard of. My friend Case said, I think about 10,000. Now, we all know the 55 Grand Cru Classé of that first classification, but we also know there's others in Saint-Emilion and in Pomerol and so forth. But I would guess that not even the most knowledgeable MW knows more than a couple of hundred wineries in Bordeaux. And then he's saying there's 10,000. Similarly, I would say with even 500 bricks and mortar wineries here in Napa, there's no geekiest of all master sommelier who knows anything like 500 wineries in Napa. And then you might ask, well, why do you even need to know? So that's an interesting question to me. That's part of that's where I'm going. Now, another one that crossed my mind is I like to take people on tours of what you can find on a grocery store shelf. Now, it really depends on where you like to shop. And Blake, I know you're in a land of plenty with some wonderful and thoughtful stores. But you're not too far from what we have, a Bevmo, Beverages and More, and you may have visited it. And if you visit my local Safeway, you can find at least 2 solid aisles of wine, stacked from the bottom to the top, 5 shelves, I think. And I would say literally hundreds and hundreds of wines in that grocery store. No other category in that grocery store has anything like that kind of diversity. I don't have to ask how many choices there are of toilet paper or even breakfast cereal, which I think some people think is amazing that there could be so many breakfast cereals. But but wine occupies more diversity, at least apparent diversity, than any of these other things. And I invite people to look at some of these labels. Now, it's sort of a mishmash, but some of these labels, if you look at them, you realize they're fun, they're amusing, labels are attractive. And sometimes I would describe some of those labels a little bit like the cover of a dime store novel. But what do we know about those wines? Where did they come from? What are they? And in many, many cases, the wines in that context are literally labels. In fact, I don't think there's much behind it. It doesn't really matter where the grapes came from or anything else. They're fun. Hopefully, they're great, quote unquote, products that taste good or appeal to the person who's buying it, and the price is right, and it's fun. Like that is one possible sense of the idea of meeting with wine.
Right.
Excuse me.
You know, I don't believe that I am a wine snob because I like all kinds of wines. I'm so regretful. I had a box of Chilean Sauvignon Blanc that I liked, and I had to get rid of it before I finished it because I needed room in the fridge. But I've drunk wine out of a can. I'll drink all kinds of wines, and yet I can tell you, and not to pick on Safeway because they're nice people and all that, but if I go to Safeway, because this happens to me, I'm on my way somewhere. Well, it doesn't happen now because I'm locked down, but it used to happen. I'm on my way somewhere. I'm going to stop in the grocery store, and maybe I'll pick up a wine for this party I'm going to, and it'll take me forever because I want to get a real wine. And most of them are they're, as you say, they're labels. They're made from bulk wine. They're concoctions. They're beverages. There aren't that many outright bad wines sold in the U.S. anymore. So they're competently made. They're going to be chemically adjusted. They're going to deliver the alcohol that you want with the fruit to cover it up. But this just isn't how I relate to wine or what I want.
Yeah, so you really helped me with that because we share that same aesthetic, and I think that the challenge is, but if that wine makes the wine drinker happy, if she or he likes it, what's the problem? And at one level, I would say no problem. I think that we don't know exactly what goes into some of those wines. Some of them maybe involve a lot of processing and chemicals, and some of them might actually be pretty straightforward. But I want to come back to my wine is magic guy. I want to tell you about his business.
Okay.
What core business was? First of all, he was calling people at a group of people in an office, calling on the phone, cold calling people, probably subscriber lists from the Wall Street Journal, telling them that they had some special insider wines for them and they could be their personal wine expert. And then what were the wines he was selling? Not one wine you'd ever heard of. And in fact, every one was bulk wine, often good bulk wine, purchased, and a label created that looked vaguely like a familiar label to us, and beautifully packaged, and an exclusive deal just for you, Blake, because you got the inside track.
Yeah, people don't realize it, but most wine clubs today, that's still what they are. They're like, oh, we've got this amazing California Cabernet Sauvignon. I know there's a big popular one. I don't want to get sued, so I'm not going to name it. But they make it seem like it's a special project of the winemaker. We've got this winemaker who wants to make this special wine, and you're going to support them. It's like, it's like a Kickstarter type thing. When in fact, it's just the winemaker putting their name on some bulk juice they purchased off the market. And again, there aren't a lot of bad, you don't have to worry about it being, having gone off bacteriologically or whatever. It's just not special. It's bulk wine that you could pour out of a spigot and you could put a different label on it. It would be interesting. They have these image searches now where you could find out, and music searches too online, where you could, if somebody tries to take your song and put their name on it, you could catch them out. It'd be interesting if you could do that with wine. If you could if there was some app, you could put the wine in and say, wait a minute, this isn't Chateau Concord. It says it's Chateau Concord, but it's exactly the same as Chateau Camera, which is for sale in this other supermarket. Because that's really how it works. All this stuff, to a certain extent, California, the bulk wine market, and again, making perfectly fine bulk wine, but it's like this giant vat. And, when you're making these supermarket labels or wine club labels, you're just turning the spigot off the giant vat into the bottle, essentially.
So no wonder anybody gets confused, because it's a little bit like what we talked about, the problem that we have today with our news and disinformation. If half of the shelf is filled with bottles of labels of wine that's perfectly good, but honestly, we don't even know what it is, it's easy to get confused. And it's very problematic. I mean, why do there have to be thousands of wines on a grocery store shelf? Honestly, if wine were a product and a brand, the way we understand, for example, Coca-Cola is a product or a brand, Coke would never proliferate to that extent. But major wineries in California feel that their only way of competing is by proliferating just as much. So acquiring labels becomes a hobby for the biggest wineries so that they can have shelf space to compete with all the other labels that are popping up. Okay, well, anyway, it sounds a bit like a rant or a complaint, but it begs a question.
Rants are totally welcome here.
Good. But it begs a question I think does matter. You use the word, Blake, real wine, and I'm interested in how you would define that. That to me gets very close to my idea of what is the meaning of wine. We won't solve it. I know we won't solve it, but we'll have a few ideas.
Well, so, a real wine is a wine. I'd like it to be an estate wine grown by someone and made by someone on the property. That's kind of the ideal, but I'm not a purist. But it's a wine where it's a wine that this bogus wine club that's overselling the personal impact of its winemakers. But what they're selling is what I think is a real wine. It's a wine that someone has paid personal attention to. If you're out there, nothing wrong with buying grapes. I'd rather it not be bulk wine. I'd rather it not be finished wine. But it's a wine that someone has stewarded. They've farmed the grapes to try to achieve something, whatever that thing is. I may not agree with it. There are wines I like and wines that I don't like in styles. But it's someone who is making a wine of intention, I guess would be for me a real wine.
That is a great wine, and wine of intention. So I want to just go back just to underscore one last time this world of wine that I'm proposing that we move away from. I got a cold call just a couple years ago from a company telling me that they had bottles of wine ready to go for me to sell to my Cain wine club. I should put in parentheses, we don't have a wine club. And wine clubs, as I understand them, because we don't have one, I don't really know, usually consist of pre-packed boxes of wine that go out with some frequency, maybe monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, whatever. And they usually represent a selection of different wines. And I think I haven't heard stories of winemakers having to make small amounts of this and that for the wine club. And another solution would be to buy these wines already made, bottled just for you. All you have to do is slap your label on for your wine club. And again, it could be a very good wine, but it absolutely was not made by anybody at that winery. They may have selected it, very much like the wine clubs, that we know about, the larger ones for the newspapers and various other organizations. They have very little to do with the production of that wine. And what you're saying, if I understand you, Blake, is with intention means it really starts in the vineyard, and there's people who had a plan all the way from the beginning.
Right. And it should be, and when you know that plan, and this is what I want to do as a journalist, because yes, an intention is an intention, but let's say that somebody's making an Napa Valley Sangiovese. Are they making it because they think Napa Valley has a good, it is kind of a mystery to me why there isn't better Napa Valley Sangiovese, but let's say that they thought, we think we've cracked the code and we're going to make a good Napa Valley Sangiovese, and that's why we're making it. Great, that's a wine of intention. It's not the thing to say that we're making a Napa Valley Sangiovese because we need some small production wine that we can sell to our wine club, because we need something to satisfy this commercial demand. So to me, that's not what I'm looking for. The only good thing about those wine clubs is when they do, occasionally a winemaker can experiment and say, well, what if we did make 100% Petit Verdot? What's that going to be like? If it works,
Exactly.
but if it doesn't work, we can sell it to the wine club. But when you're talking about these pre-packaged wines for the wine club, the first thing that I thought of is if I go into almost any Napa County winery, and not just Napa, I don't want to pick on Napa, any winery in California or practically America, you're going to see these jams and jellies and olive oils and biscuits and whatever, and they're all the same. Everybody's got their pepper jelly that, came from somewhere. The winery didn't make it. And it's funny, I never thought of this before, but the wine club argument you're making is basically the wines are like those jellies. They might be perfectly good, but they really don't have anything to do with the winery, even though they're for sale there.
And I think that is the experience is as a wine tourist, you encounter that. And if that's your first introduction to a winery, then that's kind of what you think it is. It's a boutique of various objects you can buy. They could be very luxurious. They could have literally nothing to do with the winery other than maybe they have their brand imprinted on it. And it seems like a very American and a very new world way of understanding wine. And I do want to get back, you gave me a hook with this intention because I love that word. And yet I'm about to go someplace just slightly different.
Good.
So Blake, think of the wine that really got your attention. And I'm going to mention one of mine. A lot of us who love wine will have a wine that we could call an epiphany wine. It could be a famous wine or it might be completely unknown, but it's this moment, I think, where it engages all of our senses and our imagination and our emotion. And it's like, it's just a moment where it seems that the world stops and you're smelling and smelling again, tasting and tasting again. Each time it's a different experience. And how that wine reached out of the glass to get your attention, God only knows, but it's something about us as human beings and something about what was in that glass.
If I got to confess, the wine that got my attention is not, it's not fancy. So I was doing some volunteer work in France, and it was a weird Sisyphean. It was my I'm going to go help the world phase, and it was this weird Sisyphean thing. I was in the Auvergne region, which is really not a wine region, and I was helping build refugee housing. And I know nothing about building. I did wallpaper. It's the only time I ever did anything with my hands. And we were some volunteers before us had built a house. We were living in that, or renovated house. We were living in this crappy renovated house. We were rebuilding a bigger house, and more volunteers were going to come and live in the bigger house, and they were going to build this biggest thing for refugees to go into. And that was the idea. But anyway, the French government paid for our groceries. And of course, the French government groceries includes wine. So, and I had come from Florida. I'd been a sports writer. Wine was just this sour tasting beverage that you got at a bar when it didn't serve liquor. I really had no appreciation for wine at all, and I was already in my 20s. And we got our wine from the industrial supply store. We got all our food at the supermarché, but we went to the industrial supply store and they had insecticide, and then next to it they had this giant vat of wine. And we would fill up a 5-liter jug of Vin de Table from the Auvergne region every single day. And I started drinking that, and it's interesting. I really would love to go back to this town and try this wine again now and see what I think of it. But I liked it. It was better than I hadn't experienced a lot of wine. It was better than any wine I experienced. And lucky for me, there were only 2 people in this tiny little town that spoke English. And one of them was the chemist at the fromagerie. who was always hanging out in the volunteer house because we had hot young women from Sweden and Denmark volunteering. But anyway, he started talking to me about the wine, and then he started bringing over wine all the time that we could try. And so it was, you know, my 2 months of doing this volunteer work was just an extremely eye-opening experience. It wasn't an MW. It was, I mean, it was a chemist of fromagerie, so he knew something about wine. But every day was an enlightenment. Oh my God, I didn't know white wine could be like this. You know, oh my God, I didn't know this could be like this. But it all started with this extremely cheap Van de Tab from this industrial supply store. I wonder if that's not why how I still doesn't still affect how I relate to wine in a certain way. That you know, I'm always looking for that delightful wine that I can just quaff and enjoy without overthinking about it.
What I like, one of the things I like about you, Blake, is you're not a wine snob, and we all know too many of them. So that is a good thing. What I also got from your story is how, you know, I'm sure the wine was simple, but I'm also sure, and I'm going to use a qualitative word, I'm going to say it was honest. It wasn't all fiddled with, or it wasn't made to conform any predefined expectation. It was straight ahead. It was made basically with grapes.
Right.
And
it was savory. It wasn't sweet. It was basic, but it was balanced. It had acidity. I mean, I didn't have this vocabulary then, but that's it. It wasn't cloying. It wasn't trying to be anything that it wasn't.
And it held your attention, and it was satisfying.
Yes. Delightful.
So where I'm going with all of that is you didn't, at that point, of course, you weren't untangling, you know, what kind of barrel they used or necessarily what variety, even if your informant, your informant knew, but, and I think he's a pharmacist, I believe you said.
No, he was a chemist, the cheese plant. So he understood chemistry, and he knew something about wine, but you know, he wasn't an MVP or anything.
No, but he understood about fermentation, and he understood that there's something, and I'm sure he just enjoyed tasting.
Yeah, so he what we would practically, he kept doing it, and every day he'd bring a bottle, and we would sit there and we'd drink it and we'd talk about it. And I didn't love all of them, but we always had a really good conversation about them.
So where I'm going with that is in our very new world approach, we see wine as an object that is made, and whether it's made to conform or if it's made with an intention, you know, we see that aspect of it being made. However, to me, a fundamental premise is implied in the massive selection of wines that exist. If we go to some of the really great wine shops in San Francisco, they could be small, or they could be large as say K&L. Most of those wines in the store at K&L, they all have some of the elements that you described. Like, you can say where it came from. I would say you could point to it. You could point to the vineyard. You could point to the winery. And if they were purely manufactured, they would tend to taste the same. There would be a tendency to converge. But instead, the reason there's all this diversity is there's an implied sense that each one truly is an individual, just like all the different people in the city. And because of that, it's an endless exploration. And it's too bad that we're walking through a city of real people, and then, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about Blade Runner, that you also have a world of people who could be androids that we're not quite sure if they're people or not. Yeah. And I think that's almost a perfect metaphor for the situation for someone who's trying to sift through, as you did in a grocery store setting, looking for the real wine as opposed to what I could call the ersatz wine. Because clearly there's something compelling about wine that takes us way beyond anything such as Coca-Cola. And I could say, oh, there's alcohol. Okay, fine. Even in the world of Scotch or any other sort of whiskey, there's not 1/10 the diversity that we have in the world of wine. That diversity, the promise of that diversity, is an implied promise that there truly is diversity. And that diversity couldn't come from somebody saying, oh, I like French oak, or I like malolactic, or whatever.
But I
We
think
have a million varieties.
you
Yeah.
and I have to acknowledge that we are so okay. There's a billion times people in the world, but there are also the two type of people thing. There are people who are comfortable with uncertainty, and there are people who are not. And you and I are obviously in the group of people who are comfortable with uncertainty. I am comfortable with ordering a wine and knowing I have to spend money for it and not knowing how it's going to taste. And when I do that, I rely on the sommelier a lot, and we'll have a discussion. But I'm comfortable with taking the risk. Okay, well, I don't know if I'm going to love this. Whereas there's this other big brand wine on the list that I've had, and I know what it's going to taste like. And person type 1 is going to go with that. But I'm person type 2. I've had that wine. I know it. I like it, but I want to try this other thing today. I can't ask somebody who's person type 1 who wants more certainty in their life. You ask them to try things so that they can expand these things that they know how they taste. But I can't ask them to change this basic personality trait of being comfortable with something when they don't know how it's going to taste.
Yeah, no, especially because wine is not cheap, and to think that every bottle is a crapshoot is pretty disappointing. And we have to admit that unless you're really into it, wine is just way, way too complicated.
Yeah, and unfortunately, one of the things that sucks about wine is the more you know about it, the more distance you get from the average person. And I because I had a whole world of friends before I got into wine, it's always very grounding for me to go and have dinner with them again, because they're like, you want to spend $35 for a bottle of wine? I get that a lot. Usually I just pay for the wine. It's easier that way.
Right.
But there's that. And also, they'll want to know, well, this Chardonnay, you're ordering a Chardonnay, but you're ordering one that's $70 and this one here is only 45. So as you say, they're just thinking it's Chardonnay, that's Chardonnay. And maybe they've come to wine through, we're talking about the supermarket, everything comes out of a big vat system. So why would you spend $30 more for Chardonnay when that's also a Chardonnay? But I can't. I try to make my friends. I don't try. You can't change somebody's personality. I try to open my friends' eyes to, wow, there's this deliciousness out there. But that's all I can do. Ultimately, the main thing I want to have is a nice dinner with my friend with a nice wine, and that's all.
Right. What I try to tell people who come to visit us is that we need to walk in the vineyard and we need to think about wine just like you would if you have the luxury of going to a farmer's market and you get to see the person who is selling you the fruit or the peaches or the berries or the lettuce that she grew. You don't expect it to taste exactly like the other one next door, and you might even wonder which one you should buy, but they'll all be different, and that's just fine.
Yeah, of course, wine is more different. I wish I could go to a farmer's market, but wine is more different than any other fruit. That's why it's so interesting. I've always been interested. I spent a while asking winemakers when I first started writing about wine, why don't people make interesting wines from blackberries or cherries or strawberries? What is it about grapes? And I've since learned that there are technical reasons, but part of it is the skins, and part of it is that we grow so many forms of vinifera, whereas, like different types of apples have only recently really expanded, and you're looking for different things. With apples, you're looking for overt sweetness. With grapes, you're going to transform that sweetness into something else. But yeah, wine grapes are the most interesting fruit of all. You can only start to understand it by telling people that you might think that a Granny Smith is better than a Red Delicious. You might personally like Granny Smith and not love Fuji. I'm a Fuji guy myself. But wine grapes is such a bit broader range than any other fruit.
Yeah, and I could say partially the way I see that is that vinifera, as opposed to, for example, Labrusca, many vinifera are almost not quite a blank slate. You can have Muscat that has a very distinctive perfume. You can have specific perfumes associated with some of the varieties. But when things are really kicking is when that variety delivers something different in a particular vineyard, and when it varies not just by variety, but by place. And I think that there's something about wine that we can do that we don't do with a Granny Smith or a Fuji apple. And that is, not only, we don't necessarily taste the grapes and discover all the intricacies and the nuance, but we allow it to transform into wine where it's no longer simply fruit. After that, we stick it in a bottle and we get to revisit that wine year after year, and we get to compare it with wines that grew next door or with wines from a different vintage. And it's something, apples just don't ever get that love.
Right. There's you're in Napa Valley, and by the way, we haven't talked. I am drinking Cain 5, which is the main product that Chris makes, and this is a blend of, it's the 2015. It's delicious. 2015 vintage, and it's the 5. It's called Cain 5 because it's the 5 Bordeaux varieties in a blend. But anyway, I bring this up because I want to talk about Napa Valley for a second. So you're in Napa Valley. This is terrific wine made from Napa Valley terroir. Because I'm a wine writer and a lot of friends on the East Coast, there's a tendency for people when they get together in a room, especially snobby sommeliers and certain East Coast wine writers, to bash California and Napa Valley in particular and say everybody makes the same thing. And there is, unfortunately, a lot of too much of the same thing in both California and in Napa Valley. And in Napa Valley, it's different. It's high-end same thing. It's, very ripe grapes, lots of oak. It's a taste profile that people like. There was a tasting that I went to, 7 or 8 years ago, put on by Wine and Spirits magazine for sommeliers about Napa Valley wines. It was just one of the most eye-opening tastings I've ever been to. And I thought I knew Napa Valley wines very well, but they were trying to convince East Coast sommeliers, who a lot of them were just outright anti-Napa snobs, about the greatness of Napa terroir. And it was amazing, because they picked wines from around the valley. They picked the producers who weren't doing too much to the wine, and utterly proved to a room full of skeptics with good palates, but a room full of skeptics, that the great and varied terroir that Napa has. And it really does. I'll tell you another region I feel this way about is Uco Valley in Argentina with their Malbec, because I was bored to death with Argentine Malbec and thought I never want to have any more of it. It's just, fruity and then they started going to cooler climates and finding different soils, and wow, suddenly it's interesting. And I find that to be, it's a shame when people have in Napa Valley, people have this tremendous advantage of perfect, really wine-going climate and really interesting soils for a lot of the reasons we don't need to get into, for the geological reasons, and don't always take advantage of it. I mean, that's why it's interesting that you'd think there are a lot of great wines made in Napa Valley, but to me, they're not the same great wines that everybody necessarily says by price or rating or whatever.
Yeah.
That was a rant. I said rant's welcome here.
No, that describes the nature of the problem, that wines can often tend to merge towards tasting the same. And is that about the winemaking, or is it about the place? And I would say, if you begin with some of the really, really good spots, say parts of the Rutherford Bench or going on down into Oakville, that you can begin with grapes that really have very much the same potential. And then, how different should these wines really be? And the differences would come from choices of yield, of maybe how the vines were planted, the density and the trellising, and how low they are to the ground. Another difference would be, though, also when you choose to pick, and they're all winemaking decisions. But when you get to a place where the wine really does taste differently because of where it grew, that's interesting. And some spots are going to do that more strongly than others. In other words, there are certain sites will have a stronger signal. And I would say a lot of the Napa Valley fruit is extremely friendly and generous, but it's also reasonably malleable and doesn't have necessarily a strong signal.
Yeah, people talk about, so the legendary thing is to talk about Rutherford dust, like dusty
Mhm.
grapes. Honestly, I almost never taste that, and I think that's because the grapes are just riper than they used to be, and that's a picking decision. But when you
Yes.
pick them at
Yeah.
a certain ripeness level, you lose that effect of terroir, and you make this, wine that you can charge $200 for, and maybe it gets 98 points from, a critic, but there is none of that characteristic Rutherford dust. I am not old enough to really remember when Rutherford wines tasted like Rutherford. To me, now they just taste like generic Napa Cabernet. And if you like that style, then you like that style.
I might mention just out of personal bias, a friend whose wine I think does reflect closer to what you're describing. That would be Kathy Corazon. She
Oh,
has
yeah. Yeah, I know what. Yeah, Kathy's great. Yeah.
and we're not just, she is a wonderful person and wine is wonderful, but your key idea here, that as the grapes get riper and riper, the distinctive personality of place fades away. This is an idea that I've heard many times, and I think it's probably correct. I really do. I think a lot of people are, if you're making a wine, this is the key thing. Are you making it? Is the making of the wine, the activity making it, is thus to create a certain taste or style, and that's where we move towards the very ripe, generous style. And I'll say something about that in a minute. But if Kathy is saying, no, I'm actually trying to capture what I find distinctive about Rutherford, means she can't wait too long. Otherwise, she'll lose that. And thus, she's interpreting or capturing something as opposed to just making it and imposing her signature.
Yeah, but Kathy is so unique now that now we think, so her wines, I hadn't thought of it this way until right now, but Kathy's wines probably taste like Rutherford and everybody else's wines taste like generic Napa. But now I tend to think Kathy's wines taste like Kathy because nobody else is doing it.
Well, they're both. It absolutely has her style and taste and values. But part of it is if she were getting grapes from elsewhere, her wine would taste differently. And I think that's very important to know. At Cain for many years, we had a wine that we called Cain Concept. We still have that. And the Cain Concept was entirely grapes from the valley floor, not from our own vineyard up here on Spring Mountain. And the winemaking was identical for these two wines, and the outcome was completely different. And a lot of people would tend to focus on our varietal composition as if that were the variable. But it's very difficult to believe. No, really, it's the location, it's the altitude, it's the soil, it's things that we don't understand, but we can definitely see that the wine tastes differently. And the fact that it tastes differently, but that difference transcends us, the wine people in the vineyard or in the cellar, that's when it gets interesting.
Let's talk. I want to talk a little bit about this wine. We're talking about intention. And one thing that I always find interesting talking with you about is Brettanomyces, which I do not detect at any level in this wine. It's a controversial topic among winemakers. But I know you are not shy about not being afraid of Brettanomyces and thinking that it's better to let the wine be what it's going to be than to use the kind of harsh filtering methods or whatever that would make it safer from Brett, but also would change the character of the wine.
Yeah, that's part of it. But part of it is also that going back to my first days tasting wine, some of the wines that seduced me, and I'm using that word advisedly, Brettanomyces was part of the story of how those wines came to be. And so I think we've used up a lot of our time. You might want to cut this.
We are running a little long, but it's so interesting. Let's go a little bit longer.
So my short version of this story is, after 25 years of thinking about it, and I've virtually thought about this my whole career, I realized that wine is not preserved grapes. And I absolutely will admit that in the early 80s, of course I knew wine wasn't like jelly, but I saw winemaking as a way of preserving. And now it's obvious that wine is a transformed substance. You know, it's not purely biological. It has an element of animal because the yeast and bacteria have transformed what was a purely botanical thing into something far more complex. And that's fermentation transformation that occurs in so many things. We think of kimchi, or we think of sauerkraut, of course. And you could, I'm sure you love natto. Because you love
I can
everything.
probably eat natto, but I prefer sauerkraut. Give me the choice.
I don't know how you feel about lutefisk, which is a
Well, you can have it. You can have mine.
but everybody seems to have something of this, and I find that wine, when it goes beyond fruit and becomes complex, floral, savory, is often more interesting and more intriguing than simply fruity wine. Now, I know that everybody agrees with that, but some people, of course, prefer, let's say, a farmstead cheddar from upstate New York, and others like craft cheddar cheese, so-called cheddar cheese. Very different ideas. And so Brettanomyces has just a short story in the world of enology, is that it was called out in our English-speaking world, I would say first here in the Napa Valley at the Robert Mondavi Winery in the 70s, identified as a problematic fermentation that was creating wines that were deviating or off odors and not what they wanted. And so in my first harvest in the Napa Valley, I am at Clos de Vol, and I'm learning about Brettanomyces, not because they had it in their cellar, which I think they did, but because my friends of that generation were all talking about it. And so as soon as I could, I went right back to Bordeaux. And I had worked at Mouton Rothschild, and I had friends in Saint Julien, and I asked everybody, every cellar master, what's going on with this? What about that? I was looking for that Brett signature in the cellar, and of course I found it. And they said, no, it's just a little bit reduced. And I went back to my enology professor, who was formerly trained as a microbiologist, really brilliant. Said, well, what about Brettanomyces? He said, oh yes, we know all about it in sherry and in vin sous voile like vin jaune and Farbois. And I said, well, what about red wine? He said, well, we don't know anything about that. I don't know if that's a problem. And this was literally true. I studied it also at the University of Bordeaux, and in the 80s, they did not talk about Brettanomyces. They discovered it after the Australians and the Americans and everybody else wouldn't shut up about it, and recognized it as something that was happening in the cellars of Bordeaux. And then they concluded that it was not a good thing. And in schools of enology all around the world today, Brettanomyces is a known flaw.
And yet, Brettanomyces, it does definitely have the potential to give off aromas or off flavors, but it has the potential to add lovely flavors, like rose petals are an example of the type of aroma that Brettanomyces can produce.
Right. And some of the aromas that we think of as aromas that we don't like, for example, barnyard, or even go worse, say manure, whatever, those aromas in and of themselves, if you think of the reference, manure, clearly not good. But in another context, you could have also been thinking leather, or you could have been thinking forest floor. And I give them one very simple example of how association of an aroma with what we think it is changes everything. The smell of lovely French roast coffee. It is a lovely smell to many, many people. And yet, if you're driving at night on some of the balmy evenings and you come up on a bit of a whiff of this French roast coffee, what is it? It's roadkill. It's a skunk that's been run over. It's the exact same smell. Next time you experience it, think of it. And because you're driving in your car and you know that you're not sneaking up on Starbucks or Ritual Roasters or Sight Class or something, you know that it's an animal. But the same smell could be good or bad. And this is really the way of wine, and how we become seduced by a wine is when we move beyond the objective judgment, and we go into the Dionysic phase of dreaming. And that's what engages your emotions, your memory, and it takes you on a trip.
Well, that's the thing. And I think you have to really have a lot of wine and access to a lot of wine. And I am fortunate to do this, to say what I'm going to say, because I know this is a position of extreme privilege to say that. But the main thing I want out of wine is to be interesting. You know, I don't need it to be secure. I don't need it to. I don't need to get drunk because yeah, I like a buzz, but I don't want to be wasted anyway. But I want the wine to be interesting. And if it's made too safely, if it's made to produce a cherry and vanilla beverage, then that's perfectly good. And I'm not going to tell you not to. I don't like to tell wineries not to make a lot of money, you know, because why the hell would they listen to me? You know, go ahead and make that cherry vanilla beverage, but it's not for me.
Yeah, and in fact, you know, that's really the problem here, is that that if the vast majority of wine is, as let's just say, for example, the cherry vanilla flavor, good. But who needs 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000 labels of cherry vanilla beverage?
Right. I mean, it is, we get back to the supermarket thing. It is, as you say, the big wine companies, just like, well, you know, you say Coca-Cola is not doing it, but it kind of they are. Diet Coke, 2% Coke, Coke this, Coke that, or whatever. Some of it is just Gallo, the wine group, you know, the big brands just saying, if we take over the shelves, then, you know, nobody else has any space.
Exactly. And so just to say though, Coca-Cola could easily have 10 different things. And then they have different size packages. They have cans and they have bottles and little bottles and big bottles and so forth. Still, how many labels does a company like Gallo have?
A lot. And I don't want to pick on Gallo because they make good wine.
No, they do. Really,
they really do. They're good at everything they do. But you know, part of being good at everything they do is being good at taking over those supermarket shelves. So, you know, that's, I think what it comes down to is that where you buy wine is very important, the kind of wine you're going to have. And we're in this pandemic, and it's easy to just do all your shopping at the grocery store, but you really need to support those small wine shops, because these are the places that are going to take some interest in where these wines are coming from. You know, a good wine shop is going to be, if you can find a good wine shop, that you're going to drink so much better than finding a video like this, or a friend who knows wine, or, you know, a in a restaurant. A good wine shop will get you interesting wine all the time.
I agree with that. You have to cultivate those people, chat them up. And if you can get them to talk to you, they're happy to talk.
Yeah. Well, Chris, this has been really interesting. We could probably talk for twice as long, but you know, it's a long recording, but it has been really interesting, and I really appreciate it. And I am enjoying this wine. So thank you for sending it to me. We're probably going to have some dim sum tonight, and there are not a lot of Napa Cabernets I would have dim sum with, but I think this is going to be great because it's got the acidity, and it's complex and interesting. So I'm happy with that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, that's been Chris Howell, and thanks for watching.